This is our first class under the concept of behaviors, and the exemplar is abuse and violence. And I like to always start with the SLO sheet where you guys can look at your student learning outcomes. This is where the items that are the information that you need to know in order to be successful with your exams is located in these type questions. So at the end of the class, you should be able to identify all of these items, and you have your reading assignments also to kind of help you to validate and get an idea as to what's going on here. As you know, October is the best National Awareness of Domestic Violence Month. And that tells you within that statement that domestic violence is a very serious situation in our country. Currently, we are experiencing with COVID-19, where people are oftentimes forced into isolation with their perpetrators. In addition to that content, there are also situations of people not being employed. And so there are financial situations that also add to this area of the situation that we're having problems with. So let me do another screen, and we'll start with the PowerPoint from this standpoint. Okay, so like I said, it's a very common occurrence, and it does not discriminate. Abuse involves all our demographics. We look in terms of all our communities, all of our neighborhoods, from the very wealthy all the way down to our poor income families. And our major focus is to promote safety for that victim. It may be child. If it's a child, we do mandatory reporting. And we also, for the older adult, there are adult protective agencies that are in place for them. However, with intimate partner violence, it's kind of up to the victim to report their areas. What we can do as nurses is we can provide resources to those particular individuals. Okay, so family violence, the forms are emotional, physical, sexual, and they can be either abuse or neglect. So we look in terms of the consequences of these behaviors, and we have physical injury, we have scarring, we have pain. In some cases, we end up with the victim being fatally injured, or say can lead to death. We have low self-esteem, there's self-hatred from the victim, and there's also issues with substance abuse. We have suicidal behaviors, we have anger, aggression, emotional instability, and interpersonal relationships are impaired by their inability to trust and difficulty in protecting themselves. So let's get started. As the nurse, we want to be sensitive. Sensitivity is required from a nurse who suspects family violence. It's important that the way that we come across, if we're asking questions using the words abuse or violence, it can appear judgmental and threatening to the family. And so we want to ask in ways, as to how do you solve disagreements or methods of disciplining your children? We want to go from that standpoint. And so some assessment questions we would ask just about any victim would be, tell me about what happened to you. And when we're looking at a child or maybe a dependent adult, we want to ask, who takes care of you? And then with children, we want to know what happens when you do something wrong. And with women or an older adult, we want to know, how do you and your partner, how do you and your caregiver resolve disagreements? And what do you do for fun? And we also want to know who helps you with your children and how much time do you have for yourself? If it's a partner situation, we want to know, have you been hit, kicked, or otherwise hurt by someone in the past year? If so, by whom? And we also want to ask, do you feel safe in your current relationship? Or is there a partner from a previous relationship who's making you feel unsafe now? And then we go back to parents. Some questions we want to ask is, how do you discipline your child? When your infant cries for a long time, how do you get them to stop? And we also want to know, what arrangements do you make when you have to leave your children alone? What about your child's behavior that bothers you the most? So these are some typical questions that we would ask during an interview to get an idea as to what's going on in that particular situation. We also have some signs and some symptoms or some cues that we can also be mindful of. The victim might have feelings of helplessness or powerlessness. They have repeated emergency department or hospital visits. They might have vague complaints about insomnia, abdominal pain, headaches, or hyperventilation. And the bruises that they might have going on with them may be poorly explained, and they're probably in various stages of healing. Injuries, whether it's bruises, fractures, scrapes, lacerations, if they do not seem to fit the description of the accident, we want to instantly think about partner abuse. Frightened, withdrawn, depressed, or despondent appearance, we kind of get that with the older adult. And some interventions that we can use, we want to establish rapport before focusing on the details of the violent experience. Make sure that person is comfortable and give them a chance to kind of adjust. And then, we can ask some overall questions, and then later we can get into the more detail about the violent experience as they feel comfortable. We want to assure the patient that they did not do anything wrong. We want to allow the patient to tell their story without being interrupted. If the patient is an adult, we want to assure them of confidentiality and that any changes, is up to them to be made. We're not going to force anything on them. If the patient is a child, we want to report to the appropriate authorities. In our state, we have Child Protective Services. If the patient is an older adult, we want to check state laws for reporting information. And I think we have Adult Protective Services here in our state. We want to establish a safety plan in situations where there is partner abuse, or intimate partner abuse. And in terms of what we call forensic issues are a scientific method or techniques used to collect evidence in the investigation of a crime. And so we want to follow hospital protocol. Our charting, we want it to be detailed, accurate, and up to date. And where there's sexual assault, we have oftentimes what we call the SANE nurse. And she's a sexual assault nurse examiner. And she's specialized in training to carry out exams to collect evidence from victims of sexual assault. And in terms of documentation, you want to document verbatim statements. You want to draw a body map to indicate the size, the color, shape, area, and types of injuries with the explanation. And we want to obtain permission from that victim, particularly if it's an adult and is intimate partner violence. We want to obtain permission to take some photographs, because long after those physical injuries have healed, the photographs will also give a vivid picture of the bruises and the scars and things that are taking place. In terms of child abuse, we want to use a non-threatening, non-judgmental method relationship with the parents, because as I say, when we start using the terms abuse or things of that nature, the parents are going to become defensive. So we don't want them to feel that way. I want them to feel that we are blaming them or we are judging them. We want to understand that children do not want to betray their parents. Believe me, even in the most intolerable situation, the parents are the most important security that these children know. And so they're going to be protective of their parents. So we want to provide for a complete physical assessment of the child when possible. And this will substantiate situations about their care and about, it is pretty much about their care. And this can be passed on to Child Protective Services or child welfare if it's required of us. We use dolls to help the child tell their story, because they might not know how to articulate what's happening to them, or they might be afraid of punishment. And so we use dolls, and that's an easier way for the child to act out what happens to them. And the children, when they do this particular interview with the dolls, they are there with a person that's trained, usually a psychologist or a person that's trained to work with children in those type situations. Oh, let's see. And so we want to be aware of our state agencies and policies on reporting child abuse. Healthcare workers we know are mandated, such as the nurse, like I say, healthcare workers, social workers, daycare workers, teachers. We are responsible and we are mandated to report our suspicions. Not that we have to investigate, but if we suspect child abuse, it's our obligation and it's a mandated issue that we must report. In terms of documentation, it's pretty much the same as with the adult. You want to document injuries, you want to do a body map, do photographs, and if a forensic examination is required, then the same nurse would do that, or the sexual assault nurse examiner would take care of that. With the abused partner, we want to ensure medical attention is provided. We want to ask permission to take those photographs. And if the patient wants to file charges, then the photographs will serve, to support and document their case. We want to set up an interview in a private area and ensure confidentiality. We want to, in a non-threatening manner, assess that adult for sexual abuse, substance abuse, and suicidal or homicidal thoughts. And these are all vital issues in planning care. With sexual abuse, often is accompanied by physical abuse. Survivors of abuse may self-medicate, they may self-direct or other directive violence, and because they may see this as their only way out. We want to encourage the patient to talk about the battering incident without interruption. And we want to assess for the level of violence in the home. Each cycle of violence can become more intense, and it's a danger to the victim and to their children, and it increases over time. And so questions that we might want to ask them, again, is the ones I asked earlier. Ask the patient if they feel safe in that environment. Has there been an increase in violence in that family situation? Has the patient been choked? Is there a weapon in the house that they are aware of? Has the perpetrator used or threatened to use a weapon against them, or threatened to harm the children, or even to kill the patient? We need to know this information. Also, and we know that when the perpetrator may be cognitive impaired, maybe under the influence of alcohol, their judgment is going to be impaired. So we want to know where those guns and weapons are in the home type situation. We want to ask about the welfare of the children in the home. Intimate partner abuse is often accompanied by child abuse. And does the patient have a safe place to go when violence escalates? We also want to know, if not, then we need to include a list of shelters or safe houses that they can go to. And when an abused partner makes the decision to leave, the risk for homicide drastically increases. So an emergency shelter can make the difference between life and death for that victim. And for forensic issues, we want to identify whether the patient is interested in pressing charges. And if they are, we want to give them 3 referrals. We're going to give them an attorney who specializes in abuse. We have nonprofit law firms for low-income families, and we have or individuals, and we have community advocate programs or services that are also available. Always be aware of state law for documenting and reporting suspected partner abuse. Like I say, in our state, I know it is a crime, but it's considered battering. So they would be maybe pressing charges for assault or for battery in those situations. We want to provide a written plan to that person. It includes the shelter and referral numbers that they can use during the escalation of anxiety before actual violence erupts. And this is, a sense of urgency or emergency. And this might be their motivation to leave, and a plan must be in place to keep them safe. And we want to emphasize the following again: no one deserves to be beaten. You cannot make anyone hurt you, and it is not your fault. We want to encourage the patient to reach out to family and friends whom they might have been avoiding. Often survivors isolate from family and friends due to either shame or control of the partner, who wants to isolate them. If the patient is not ready to take actions at this time, we're going to provide a list of community resources available, such as hotlines, shelters, support groups, community advocates, and social services. And we're going to talk about safety plans when we go through our PowerPoint to kind of reinforce what we've talked about. With the older adult, we want to assess for severity of signs and symptoms of abuse and potential for further abuse. And we want to do this on a weekly basis to kind of assess. And I think about the home health nurse when they go into these family type situations. You know, assess, notice if your patient is wearing a saturated diaper or is laying in feces, or if their skin is beginning to break down. We want to note these situations. You also want to be aware of the environmental issues because, you know, we want to look at the home environment. Is the house in deplorable condition? We want to look at those factors as being considered areas of abuse or neglect as well. And if abuse is suspected, we want to discuss it with the older adult and the caregiver, but we want to do them separately, you know, and this way it will kind of cut down on the misunderstandings and minimize friction between the patient and the caregiver. We want to discuss with the older adult factors that led to the abuse as well. We want to stress our concerns for their physical safety. And when we do this, stress the concerns, this validates that this is a serious situation. And forensic issues with the older adult, we need to know our state laws regarding older adult abuse, and we will notify our supervisor, the physician, or the primary care for that person, and social services when a suspected abuse is reported. Okay, so now we're going to go through the PowerPoint. The PowerPoints are very detailed, so I'm not going to read everything. It's just kind of our way to kind of wrap up everything and kind of do a recap here. Okay, so as I said earlier, our population's at risk. We're looking at children, we're looking at the older adult, and we're looking at the intimate partner. Oftentimes with a child that's less than 1 year old, we will probably see traumatic brain injury. And this is from shaken baby syndrome. What happens here is an adult can shake an infant for just 5 seconds and the brain bobbles off the skull and it causes bleeding and it causes injury to the brain. We can also have, you know, retinal bleeding and things like that that can lead to blindness. It can also cause later on intellectual deficits as well. You think in terms of abdominal injuries, you know, and you think in terms of an adult punching a 3 or 4 year old toddler or child, and then you have to think about the internal bleeding, such as lacerated livers and things of that nature. When we look at burns, we're thinking about situations where it's maybe they're punishing or they're angry with the child, maybe for something as simple as maybe soiling their pant, you know, or something of that nature. And they would immerse this child into hot liquids, it could be water or whatever. But if they immerse their hands, and you will see burns that's in the shape of a glove, or the same with the feet, it's going to be what they call sock-like burns. And sometimes they will burn the child with cigarettes, and those are going to be circular type patterns that you would find. And with the older adult, we often have abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. Oftentimes, the person is living in the home with the older adults, and they are abusing their finances and things of that nature. And so let's go to the next slide, and we're looking at intimate partner violence. And you'll note that around the ages of 16 to 24 is our highest percentage where this takes place. And it usually starts with kind of trying to control what this person wears, and it kind of goes on to closing in as their social circle, whereas the perpetrator is pretty much the only person that they're involved with. And it starts with the slapping, the kicking, punching, strangling, etc. And it gets more and more intense as those situations take place. And we've talked about the consequences, physical injury, and we have mental health issues as well. And like I say, long after those physical injuries have healed, we still have the mental scarring that's there. And those can be in the form of post-traumatic stress, depression, suicide attempts, and, you know, completed or incompleted, with the self-esteem issues, with the developmental delays, anxiety, eating disorders, substance abuse. And then we look at the effects on the pregnant mother. We know that when a woman becomes pregnant, they're in their most vulnerable stage. And oftentimes the perpetrator decides, so he feels that the victim is going to probably love that child more than him, or that child is going to take their place. And so oftentimes they will become emotionally and physically violent with the pregnant mom. And those are some situations we want to be aware of. Okay, so let's talk about this little class discussion here. We did this in class. And so we talked about Chloe, who's 25 years old, a woman with torn clothing, has bruises around her face and her neck, and she states that she fell from a ladder while hanging a picture on her wall. And so her husband, Chad, he's there, he's agitated, and he's pacing outside the triage area. So obviously we can observe him through an open area. So based on the following statement, what are your best actions? And your best actions would be, we have a select all apply here, and it's a critical thinking question. So what would you do? Would you tell Chad that Chloe is fine, but no room for visitors is provided? That would be a definite. Have staff members make regular contact with Chad in the waiting room. Yes, they could acknowledge him, but we don't want him to make him suspicious. But, you know, in case he, you know, looks like he's looking for answers, we can, you know, go up, ask how he's doing, and then ask him, you know, can we help be of service? We want to immediately call hospital security. Why would we do that? He's not loud, he's not being belligerent, he's not causing any altercations, so there's no need for hospital security. Move Chloe to a secluded area in the emergency department so that you can interview her in private. Most definitely, we would do this. We would insist that Chloe admits she's being abused by Chad. No, we would not, because that would interfere in our establishing rapport with the patient. Immediately report the abuse to the police department? No, that would not be our choice to make. The patient is in charge and she makes those decisions. And so she would decide if she wants to press charges or not. In the event that she does, we can supply the resources for her to do so. But this is the patient's own choice. We're empowering the patient to make their own decisions. And of course, we'd also, once she acknowledged, we'd also let her know about safe shelters and offer some brochures. Let her know that there are hotlines that are available, and we would give her information about shelters. And we would also talk about a safety plan as we go along. So when we think about the cycle of violence, and this is the typical situation, and like I said, when things get really critical and that person decides it's time to leave. So let's look at this. We have the abuser and we have the victim. And our first stage is the tension building stage. You know, things are just kind of tense. And the abuser, he's probably being emotionally abusive toward the victim, verbally, maybe slapping and hitting her. And she's to the point where she's walking on eggs and she's trying to do everything right to avoid these situations. And then it gets to the point where, in spite of all of this she's done, the abuse actually takes place, where he physically injures the patient, oftentimes might lead to a visit to the emergency department, or, you know, she's all battered and bruised and she's wearing makeup to cover up these areas. This is the time that we're most likely to be able to get the victims to leave this situation. And if not this stage, then the last stage is what we call the honeymoon stage. And when the honeymoon stage comes, the victim is going to feel like there's hope, because the perpetrator is going to be apologetic. He's going to be super nice. He's going to probably be buying flowers and gifts and apologizing, and probably stating a willingness to go into treatment at this time. And so, like I said, the victim sees that all is well and it's going to be okay. But then if that cycle is not broken, we're going to go back to the same cycle over and over again until that victim decides to leave the situation. In terms of assessment, like I said, most often women are seen in the emergency department or in a physician's office with our GYN, and this is where they would probably ask questions, you know, have you been harmed by anyone, or things of that nature. And then we will also have the opportunity to do x-rays and things like that and do a thorough physical examination. And remember that we talked about rape or pregnancy might be a part of the abuse. And so you want to check that woman for STDs and things of that nature and look for signs of infection or trauma. We've mentioned the psychological scars. Long after the physical have healed, the psychological is still there. Forensic issues, we talked about that, involving legal ramifications and collecting evidence. We want to give the victim information about attorneys and clinics and things of that, legal clinics that can be of help to them. Or we can also give them information about hotlines and battered women's shelters and aid for families with dependent children. We can give them all that type of information. And this is we look at our basic safety plan. We want to address this with the victim to make sure that if arguments or the violence tend to escalate, we want to move to a room or avoid rooms where there's only one entrance or one exit. We want to make sure that they can have a way in and a way out of that room. Avoid rooms with potential weapons. Like I said, we want to know where guns are in the home. And we also want to avoid the kitchen because the kitchen has tons of weapons, knives and things of that nature. We want to know where the quickest route out of the home is. And we want to know the quickest route out of our workplace or out of our school or whatever. And so oftentimes if this victim person is maybe in school or at work, she can probably provide security with a photograph of this perpetrator. And that way, if they see them enter the building, they can alert the victim and she can maybe escape the situation. You want to tell your neighbors about what's going on, at least one neighbor, someone you can confide in, and tell them if they hear noise or if they hear altercations, then they can call the police and let them know what's going on. We recently had an episode here in our city a few weeks ago, whereas they had an altercation, this male and the victim, and he killed her out in the street. She had run out the house. He had a gun, put it to her neck. And by that time, someone had called the police department. And as a result, the police were there. They witnessed what happened, and they in turn also end up fatally killing the perpetrator as well. So if you have children, you want to have a code word for the kids. You know, when I say this word, you know that it's a problem, and you can go and you can contact or call grandma or call, you know, or alert a neighbor or somebody like that. And like I said, we need to have a safe place selected in the event that we have to leave. And so some very important items that you might want to include, you might want to have a little bag packed with maybe 3 or so days worth of clothing, a calling card, a month supply of medications. You want to have copies of important documents and put the bag in a place where you can easily grab it. Maybe it's outside in the garage, or better yet, maybe you have a friend that you can leave these items at their home. And so when you have to leave the situation, then you can get these items from your friend. You know, you want to have a calling card or a cell phone that you don't use and that he cannot track that cell phone. We want to make sure we have all these items in place so that, you know, escape will or leaving the situation in a rush won't be so stressful. And why do abused partners stay? We think about these situations and over again, the victim stays. Well, sometimes they have no other means of financial support and they've accustomed themselves to a certain lifestyle and they feel that, you know, my children are cared for, they're in private schools or whatever the situation may be. We have this fabulous home, and so I can endure this situation just for that reason. So we have those type situations taking place. And there's sometimes low self-esteem where the victim feels powerless, you know, no matter what, he's more powerful than they are. And so what's the use? They just kind of given up. Sometimes depression might be involved, whereas they just don't have the energy to leave the situation. Let's look at child abuse. When we look at child abuse, we're looking at the different types And the most common that we deal with, like I say, we have physical abuse, but we also have neglect that takes place as well as the other two. In a neglectful situation, oftentimes these kids are probably tardy or missing a lot of time from school. When they come to school, they often appear to be hungry, like at mealtime, they might be stealing food from others, or they might be eating like it's their last meal. They might have sores or things in them that's not healing, or their clothing might be ill-fitting, might not be the proper size for that particular child. We want to look at those situations. And this is where, as like I say, if they're spending a lot of time away from school, or they taking care of themselves at home, or they what we used to call the latchkey kids, you know, we need to assess those situations. And if we suspect, it's our responsibility to report it to Child Protective Services. Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, this is a national situation, whereas, you know, any recent acts of failures to act on the part of a parent, and I forget the name of the alert that goes out, but usually over the television airwaves, it goes out, you know, in the event of death or serious physical harm to the child. This is our Child Abuse Protection Act. Each state has their requirements. This is the basic law here. They can add more in addition to it, but they cannot subtract anything from the law. Okay. And in reporting, as I said, we are the people that are legally responsible. So you can read through this slide and get a better understanding. In terms of older adult abuse, we have these situations here: physical abuse, and it's self-explanatory. Psychological abuse, the terms of humiliation, I'm sorry, I can't talk, humiliation, threatening, mental anguish, and those type situations, and the financial abuse or exploitation. All of these are self-explanatory here. And so, like I said, we want to assess that adult in terms of abuse. Particularly if you notice how they act when the caregiver is present. You know, are they kind of anxious, or are they kind of shirking away, or they withdraw? And we want to look at those type situations. And we also, like I say, bed sores, skin lesions, not getting proper medical or dental care, their eyeglasses may be broken, or their dentures might be in disrepair, or their hearing aids. You know, are they getting to their appointments on time as scheduled? Or are they getting their medications as required? We want to look at all those situations. And oftentimes with the older abuse situations, we have adult protective services that we can initiate, and they will come out and they will do an investigation. If that patient, older adult, is competent, they can make their own decisions, and you know, as to whether they want to take the recommendations or not. But sometimes there are situations when that person may come into the hospital with broken bones and bruising and things of that nature, and social services is going to step in and they're going to do an investigation. They will probably put that patient into a safer environment under those circumstances. We want to look at resilience and adaptation. In spite of all of these hardships that some people have gone through, they become advocates, and this just shows their resilience. And usually what happens is, once they're able to leave that type of situation and get some psychological services such as therapy and things of that nature, they go on to overcome, and they can be productive individuals in their lives. Okay, any questions or concerns? I still encourage you guys to try and use the discussion board. We will check that, but you can also email me. So this ends our class content, and I want you guys to have a great day. Thank you.